Hello, everybody. We are on our third section of the conference, and it will be chaired by Professor Michael Laskier. Everybody that wants to present, you can do it, no problem. It's open. Please, Michael.
Okay. So welcome to, good afternoon. Welcome to the third session of this workshop, which focuses on biographies and autobiographies. My name is Michael Laskier. I'm Professor Emeritus of Bar-Ilan University, where I spent many years. And subsequently, I joined the Western Galilee College in 2018, and I've been there since. I will quickly go through the list of all the speakers. I will say a priori that to please adhere strictly to the 25-minute time limit, and then we will later open it to for discussion. So I'll go first through the names. Our first speaker is Dr. Aaron Pascha from Western Galilee College, and he will be speaking on Diaries, Memoirs, and Post-War Frankness, revising the German generals in the ego documents frame of Holocaust apologetics. The second speaker will be Dr. Asaf Mond, who is pursuing his postdoctoral research at the Open University of Israel. His topic is the First World War experience of Avigdor Hameri. Then we will have Dr. Shai Strugo from Haifa University, who will talk about turning the Arab waterfront into a Jewish space, micro-historical study on the Thessalonican maritime milieu in the waterfront of Haifa, 1930-1932. And the final presentation will be by Dr. Sasha R. Goldstein Sabah, Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. She will be speaking on the letters of Ibrahim Nahum, reading Iraqi Jewish history through the eyes of a middle-aged man. What we will do now is I will give the floor to Dr. Yaron Pasher. Please, Yaron, say a few words briefly about yourself, and then please do go on with your presentation.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chaim, for organizing this fascinating workshop. Thank you, Michael. My name is Dr. Aaron Pasher, and I am a military historian, and I am heading the military division in our Holocaust Studies program at Western Galilee. And today I will speak to you about diaries and post-war frankness, and I will just share my screen with you and begin my presentation. Okay. Okay, so the diaries and memoirs, just put a timer so I'll be right on track. The diaries and memoirs, which were written after the Second World War by German generals who served in the Wehrmacht, are an important source for understanding the events of the Second World War, although they should be dealt with caution and therefore treated critically. The writers of these compositions are likely to use an apologetic flair to their writing whenever they mention their part in the campaigns that allegedly were conducted parallel to extermination activities and genocide. All try to supply a clean cut of the events, while in most cases, one could find inaccuracies regarding the level of awareness of their involvement in connection to war crimes and crimes against humanity that the regime they were a part of committed. Scholars, however, like Omer Bartov, Wolfgang Wette, and Jochen Bulle have meticulously cataloged the Wehrmacht's war crimes in adherence to National Socialist ideology, The myth of the clean Wehrmacht has been fully exposed by the late 1990s. The debate in recent years concerning these sources, whether testimonies during trial, interviews, or private papers, is that they are unreliable on many accounts. Still, by re-examining these sources as mere ego documents, with this awareness in mind, one can easily identify that when the writer of these sources detaches himself from the direct events in order to protect their court cases, they do tend to be precise, a pattern that repeated itself during the interrogation of these criminals at Nuremberg and apparently sneaked into their post-war writings. Cross-informational steps, therefore, related to the same events from different writers usually gives the historian a clear picture of what occurred. The harsh criticism that is being heard of Basil Littleheart in recent decades applies mainly to Littlehart's own attempt to influence the generals to accept his version as though he were the main influence on the all-armored warfare in Germany and the inspiration for the German Blitzkrieg. The self-serving attitude of German generals at the end of the war and how their biased or sometimes ignorant or twisted views are no longer taken as truth in academic military literature after Littleheart has given more than enough credit to their perspective or claims brings the discourse to a new level. A brief example is Karl Dönitz in his memoirs, which overestimated German naval capabilities and U-boat warfare way too much and claimed he was not a Nazi nor was the German Navy Nazified and that they were unaware of the Holocaust. If Dönitz spoke truth, the question is why then Hitler did appoint him as his successor. It's now widely known and accepted that the memoirs of senior German military figures have to be read with caution. There are a number of reasons why the general's accounts are so skewed. Implication or association with criminality, with criminal activity is certainly one. Protecting the good name of the Wehrmacht is another. One has to look at the broader picture of the global history in which these memoirs were written, for instance, during the Cold War, when for various political reasons, historians of the West were keen to accept the general's own views of their activities. In Nuremberg, for instance, at points they were not threatened and did not fear consequences. They answered quite freely and gave detailed answers. The first generation of historiographical writing on the war included different versions. It was only natural that each side of the participating parties wrote its official history on the Second World War so that it served the political needs and collective memory designed at all times. All, however, were influenced at the beginning by ego documents since there was nothing else to reach for. The captured archival material by the Allies was not yet available for research. The Soviet historiography, for instance, which saw in 1941 as the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, split more or less into two periods at the time in its official approaches towards it. The treatment and changes made in the official Soviet history can be characterized as part of the ongoing changes that occurred in the Russian communist regime during almost 50 years that passed from the end of the war until its collapse. During Stalin's time, there was no Soviet historiography. The Soviet tyrant speeches and compositions from the war days that were compiled in one volume under the title The Great Patriotic War by Joseph Stalin and were actually a bunch of ego documents served for the years after the war and certainly until his death in 1953 as the only official Soviet history. At the beginning of the Cold War, the official Soviet history was rewritten in the context of the Soviet propaganda against the West and went through several transfers and revisions during the communist regime. In the first years after the war, the aim was to glorify Stalin's figure and give him the credit for defeating Germany. In addition, there was an attempt of undermining Russia's allies' part in the war as if their contribution was not significant. As for Western historiography in general, the Western historians that wrote about the war in the early years tended to adopt the basic Soviet approach, while they do point on further elements that influenced the German downfall, such as fighting on two fronts and failure in estimating the Soviet strength and power. But outside the Soviet Union, already in the beginning of the Cold War, there were totally different arguments heard from the official Soviet version. Vladislav Andels, a Polish general that fought against the Germans side by side with the Allies and which represented the anti-Soviet approach, wrote his account of the war in Russia as an ego document during a period that in the West no one else was engaged in writing it, and therefore was in fact the first to raise doubt about the abilities of the Russian Colossus, laying the foundations for future Western historiography. Contrary to the version the Russian leadership tried to root, as if the victory over Germany belonged exclusively to the impressive abilities of the Red Army and the Soviet system, Handels held a view that the Russian victory was first and foremost an outcome of the military supplies that the Allies and Americans and the British pumped into the campaign. The German historiography related to the war before the reunification of Germany was influenced naturally from the geopolitical situation that was created after the final surrender. In East Germany, the writings was influenced from the Soviet approach, and in Western Germany, from the Western historiography. The profound impact led by the Nuremberg trials on the German population created an apologetic approach in the German way of writing history, while the Basil Littleheart interviews with the German officers were to a certain extent the designing line. The general's memoirs and diaries served as primary material for the first wave of West German writing. In most cases, this was a unilateral history, while the entire blame for the failure of the war was put on Hitler as an amateur or a dilettante strategist. Only in the beginning of the 1980s, with the publication of the Militärgeschichtliche Forschungsamt series, an official line of writing was forming shape. Lack of preparation for the war in Russia, underestimation of the Soviet power, production ability, and Soviet endurance to fight a war of attrition for long that eventually enabled victory over the Nazi regime turned to be the leading and main approach in Germany to the day. Basil Littleheart was many things, but above all, he was a military historian. He wrote tracts on Sherman, Scipio Africanus, Rommel, and on military strategy itself. His work influenced Neville Chamberlain and may have even accidentally influenced the misperception relating to the Wehrmacht's parts in the atrocities during the Holocaust. Littleheart and Fuller, J.C.F. Fuller, were for the young officers after 1920, British and German, the modern military officers, particularly in the way they carefully studied and all the articles read. In Germany, only Guderian and von Reichenau fought for the mechanization of warfare. The other high generals before 1939 and the bulk of the general staff faced these revolutionary developments with skepticism, including the chief of general staff, Ludwig Beck. It was a struggle between the antiquated aristocratic soldier of the 19th century and the youthful technician soldier of the emerging modern age. At a time when he was feeling particularly frustrated after the Second World War, Littleheart understandably exaggerated the contrast between the neglect of his ideas by British generals and their enthusiastic reception by the generals. In fact, he had his supporters in the British army, while his influence in Germany was largely due to three pro-Nazi generals, Blomberg, Reichenau, and Guderian, who were all well placed in the 1930s to promote his ideas. In May 1945, as the Second World War was drawing to a close, the British journalist and military writer Basil Littleheart was something of a neglected figure. At the outbreak of war in 1939, he had been the leading military commentator in Britain, politically well-connected and influential, and had also established a formidable reputation as a military theorist and historian. However, the rapid defeat of France had discredited his theories, leaving him isolated and with no role in the war effort. Littlehart's reputation, however, as one who decisively influenced the supporters of the armed warfare in Germany during the interwar period, has recently been put at stake and thrown into question. It has been revealed that this reputation was largely self-propagated, and that to create it, he actually exploited the plight in which the German generals were after the war, unscrupulously manipulating their evidence for his own ends. For several years after the war, the German generals were detained as prisoners of war by the Allies, awaiting the decision on whether to put them on trial or war crimes. On trial for war crimes. Littleheart made contact with a group of them who were held not far from his house in the Lake District in the north of England in a POW camp at Grisdale Hall. He interviewed them on their pre-war and war experiences and soon developed further contacts with other senior German generals held in Germany. Their evidence served as the basis for his book, The Other Side of the Hill, or The German General's Talk, as the American edition was called. Out of the deepest conviction and best of motives, Littleheart became one of the leaders of an unpopular public campaign on the German general's behalf. He argued relentlessly that they were no more than honorable and patriotic professional soldiers who had generally kept aloof from politics, had had an instinctive dislike for the Nazi regime, and most important, had not been involved in Nazi atrocities. In this respect, he accidentally planted the seeds for future Holocaust deniers such as David Irving and Carlo Mattogno. In The Other Side of the Hill, he collaborated with the defeated apologetic generals in developing this influential line of argument, which later historical research would increasingly qualify and reject. He denounced as unjust and vindictive the intention to prosecute the generals as war criminals, acted to improve their prison conditions, and tried to ease their discomfort by personally sending them parcels with small amenities such as food and tobacco. Only by going through the files which are available for research at the Littleheart Center for Military Archives in King's College London, and are a mere bunch of ego documents, can one get a true measure of the immense time and effort he invested in the matter over the years. The Littleheart Archives Center in London provides, among other documents related to the trial of Erich von Manstein for war crimes. It was held in Hamburg between August and December 1949. Reports and memorandums relating to the interrogation of German officers, captured notes Littleheart wrote during his talks with them. There is a clear division in the archive between the materials that found their way into Littlehart's book, The Other Side of the Hill, and those that Littleheart chose not to use in his book. Therefore, the evidence he chose not to include in the book is extremely interesting, for it of course did not correspond with the thesis he sought to present. Naturally, Littlehart's personal contacts with the German generals, his role as the one who recorded and presented their war histories to Western readers, and his strong public support for them bound the generals to him by feelings of gratitude, self-interest, and dependency. And German generals' recognition of his influence was the chief means by which Littleheart sought successfully to resurrect his reputation after the sharp eclipse it has suffered after the fall of France and during the Second World War. Three cases were of particular significance for Littleheart: Guderian, Rommel, and Manstein. In Manstein's case, Littlehart's efforts did not bear fruit, despite the fact that the field marshal was heavily in his debt. Von Manstein was a major ego document figure, and with the strong insistence he had of not knowing about the Holocaust anything, which bluntly falsifies the truth. Littleheart intervened to relieve the hardship and humiliation which Manstein endured in his prison as prisoner of war camp. On Manstein's request, he arranged for his wife and child to be transferred to his sister's house in France, in the French zone of the German occupation. He campaigned against Manstein's being tried as a war criminal, assisted in his defense when he was put on trial, and fought for his release after he had been convicted. He took under his care the publication of the English edition of Manstein's war memoirs, Lost Victories, in 1958, and as late as the 1960s, intervened to secure a place at Cambridge for Manstein's son. Yet despite Manstein's gratitude, he withstood Littlehart's indirect attempts through Manstein's lawyer and biographer to make Littleheart the inspiration behind the Ardennes operation, which von Manstein had conceived and which had led to the Allies' collapse in the West in 1940. Over the years, however, there was a growing assumption for which Littleheart was responsible as a result of his interview with the German generals, that they were all outstanding professionals, unaware of what was happening at the rear of the front lines, and of course had nothing to do with it. Von Manstein is a good example of such men, but eventually he too was tried at Hamburg for crimes against humanity. One obvious issue that arises from the documents relating to his trial is that von Manstein, a tank genius and the strategist, knew about everything that was happening in the territories under his command, and especially in the area of Simferopol in the Crimea. When asked by psychiatrist Leo Goldenstone at Nuremberg whether he had heard of the Einsatzgruppen who operated under his jurisdiction, he said that Commandant SS Major General Otto Ollendorf's Einsatzgruppe was in his district, and that he had heard of them for the first time as Field Marshal responsible for all operations in the district. Naturally, he said, he had heard of these commando units existed, but was told that they were SS formations whose job was to maintain strict order. Quote from his trial: what they did, I never knew. All I know is that they were active in other army group areas as well. Perhaps someone told me by coincidence that something not quite right happened around September when I just arrived. However, I was sent there as a military commander, and most of my time was spent at the front. Never have I seen or heard reliable testimony about these Einsatzkommandos shooting Jews en masses. Such activities did not happen under my command, and in reality, I couldn't have done anything about them. Littleheart had more luck with Roma's family, with Field Marshal Romel's family. When the General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel died by forced suicide of Hitler's command, he left behind in various ingenious hiding places the papers that recorded the story of his dramatic career and the exact details of his masterly campaigns. It was his custom to dictate each evening a running narrative of the day's events, and after each battle, to summarize its course and the lessons to be learned from it. He wrote almost daily intimate and outspoken letters to his wife, in which his private feelings and after the tide had turned found expression. To this is added by Roman's son, Manfred, the story of the field marshal's last weeks and the final days, when he was given the choice of an honorable suicide or a trial for treason. The field marshal's wife and son were very anxious that Littleheart would edit an English edition of his Ego Documents papers. Rommel had many critics in the German army and general staff who disputed his qualifications as a strategist and his conduct in North Africa and Normandy, and who held that his abilities had been greatly exaggerated by the Germans and Allies' war propaganda. Littleheart clearly indicated in his first letter to Mrs. Rommel that he would make a favorable case on his behalf. On his persistent urging, Rommel's family and his chief of staff in North Africa, General Fritz Bayerlein, provided flimsy but reasonable evidence that Rommel, like most German officers, had known of Littleheart during the 1930s and had probably read some of his writings through, though he himself had not been converted to armor before 1940. In one of his papers, Rommel had also referred to an article Littleheart had written during the war. Littleheart, however, did not accept the job of editing Rommel's papers before he extracted from Rommel's family and from Bayerlein statements that made Rommel nothing less than his pupil, who had been highly influenced by his tactical and strategic conceptions. He inserted this statement in the English edition of the Rommel papers in 1953, but failed to make the Bayerlein have it incorporated in the German one. The most important case for Littleheart, and the one in which he won his crowning success, was that of Guderian, Germany's foremost armored pioneer. The two corresponded extensively from September 1948, Littleheart questioning Guderian on the development of the Panzer arm and the conduct of the war. The brisk and abrasive Guderian had almost made himself quite a number of enemies in the German army, both before and during the war, and was interested in getting his side of the story told. The other side of the hill had been published before he and Littleheart made contact, but Littleheart was planning a second and large edition of the book. At about the same time, he inquired if Guderian had considered writing his war memoirs. Guderian was receiving no pension, was then living with his wife in one room under conditions of virtual poverty. As he wrote to Littleheart, he was also involved in the efforts of the British influence in the Panzer Arm to have the German general's pension restored. Publishing his memoirs was for him, if nothing else, a means to earn a living. Littleheart took it upon himself to find the British and American publishers for the memoirs, and also put Guderian in touch with British and American journals. Littleheart worked hard to soften and remove the problematic passages in the book, find another publisher, and finally secure the best financial terms for Guderian. And when the book Panzerleader in 1952 was published, it became a bestseller. Littleheart asked for 25% of the royalties, which Guderian himself had offered him for his immense trouble. His request remained unanswered, for Guderian had died just a few days later. The more Guderian's debt to Littleheart had grown, the more persistent Littleheart inquiries became regarding his influence upon him, and the more did Guderian realize that he would have to contribute to the kind of acknowledgement that Littleheart wanted to the mutually beneficial relationship. Okay, sorry. At the time, Littleheart was taking the publication of Guderian's memoirs under his care and was promising Guderian that the chapter devoted to him in the new edition of The Other Side of the Hill would present him as more important than Hitler. When Guderian failed to take up his hints, he resorted to more direct measures, going over the English translation of the book. Littleheart was unsatisfied. He wrote to Guderian, I'm just about to finish. You might care to insert a remark that I emphasize the use of armored forces for long-range operations against the opposing army's communications, and also propose a type of armored division combining Panzer and Panzer infantry units, and that these points particularly impressed you. Coming after Littlehart's tremendous efforts over the publication and contract of the book, his request was not refused. Guderian inserted in Panzerleader the following paragraph after the one he had originally written for the German edition. Quote, further, it was Littleheart who emphasized the use of armored forces for long-range strokes operations against the opposing army's communications, and also proposed a type of armored division combining Panzer and Panzer infantry units. Deeply impressed by these ideas, I tried to develop them for our own army. So I owe many suggestions of our further development to Captain Littleheart. These famous lines established Littlehart's reputation for a generation as inspiration behind the German Blitzkrieg. Such strong evidence left little room for doubt, especially as Littleheart took care to cover his tracks. He apparently removes his letter to Guderian and Guderian's letter of agreement from his archive. When manufactured evidence is revealed, the damage to one's case might be fatal. Littlehart's claim for influence on the Germans has lost its credibility in the eyes of historians. Some even went far as calling him a liar. At the very least, it has become clear that he exaggerated this influence, and at the expense of J.C. Furler and other British army pioneers. At the same time, not only his case, but British influence as a whole on the evolution of the Panzer arm, which previously was taken for granted, has now been called into question. And yet, Littlehart's self-inflicted injury in trying to write the historical record himself does not close the case, but merely opens it afresh. The fact that he was fraudulent does not necessarily mean that he was wholly incorrect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yaron, for this very eloquent presentation.